most exciting. Most exciting. Oh, hello, didn't see you there. Just catching up on some reading. 50 years behind. Do you know, I've long thought that Gerry Anderson is Britain's answer to Walt Disney, and it's criminal that he's not recognised as such. During the 1960s, he fired up my imagination as a young child, because I'm that old, probably more than anything else I watched. Stingray, Thunderbirds, Captain Scarlet, even his earlier shows, Fireball XL5, Supercar. I drank them all in, and his incredible stories of adventure and excitement and disaster and aliens just got my imagination working into overdrive. And as much as shows like Doctor Who, it's responsible for me being here doing this now and having this abiding lifelong interest in fantasy and science fiction, all those sort of offshoots. And it does annoy me and frustrates me that Gerry's not exactly forgotten, but he isn't held in the esteem he should be culturally in this country. People who know his work and remember his work, of course, they love and adore it, but it does concern me that generations to come won't know the name Gerry Anderson. They may know Thunderbirds, they may know Captain Scarlet if they haven't disappeared, but they won't know Gerry Anderson's name. And I just think that's shocking, because he did so much to provide fantastic, imaginative and eventually colourful entertainment for a generation of children who, I'm one of them, will never forget it. There should be Anderson theme parks all over the country. There should be a massive Gerry Anderson production organisation that's making new shows, either based on his ideas or based on things that he would have approved of. Adventure shows, fantasy shows, science fiction shows. A British Walt Disney. That hasn't happened, and that's a crying shame. We do have Anderson Entertainment, which is sort of led by Gerry's son Jamie, which keeps the name alive, but it's very much a nostalgia market. And that's fine, but I just think that Gerry should be held in higher regard. The reason I'm talking about this today is that I'm talking about one of Gerry's better known shows from the 70s. Gerry reigned supreme throughout the 60s. He developed supermarionation, puppets, and created these incredible adventure shows. He never really appreciated what he did. He worked with puppets on sufferance because he started out doing puppet shows for Roberta Lee. He wanted to do his own things, and eventually he started to do shows from his own studios, from his own imagination. We had things like Supercar, we had Fireball XL5, which led on to the phenomenal Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet, and then lesser shows towards the end of the decade, Joe 19, The Secret Service. But Gerry, he wanted to do live action. And as the Supermarionation shows went out of fashion in the late 60s, and his Century 21 production empire, which had been this massive cottage industry, if you can have a massive cottage industry, in the UK with comics and records and toys, it was massive. It was running out of steam in the late 60s, and Gerry finally got the chance to do something live action. I'm not talking about that particular show today, that's UFO and Us to Come, but I'm talking about his last big live action show, his big, massive ITC-backed show, which was Britain's answer to Star Trek, or could have been. Today I'm talking, ladies and gentlemen, about Space 1999. Let's go! It's interesting talking about Gerry's work, and I can talk about it for ages, with a little bit of authority, I hope, because I've read a lot of books and I've read a lot of magazine articles and all sorts of things. So I know a fair bit about Gerry's work. And I think Space 1999 is particularly interesting because of its origins and where it came from. Now, in 1969, Gerry started working on what I still believe to be his magnum opus, his finest 26 hours. That's UFO. That was his story of a war of attrition between a militaristic force on Earth and a race of aliens from a dying planet who were coming to Earth to effectively harvest bodily organs and take them back to their home planet to keep their sterile race alive. Big, bold, adult stuff for a man who dealt with puppets for the last 10 years. UFO was a game changer for Gerry. It was his chance at last to do a live-action TV series, and he had dabbled with live-action a couple of years before with a film called Doppelganger, or as it was known in the States, Journey to the Far Side of the Sun. A slightly tepid and dreary space adventure about an astronaut played by Ray Finnis, who at the time was quite well known for the American sci-fi series The Invaders, who travelled into space and discovered, as the title suggests, on the other side of the sun, a mirror image of Earth where everything is flipped and reversed. The film wasn't a hit, but there were elements of it which Gerry used in his next project, including some of the actors and some of the props and sets and effects and things. And he went on to create UFO. I could talk about UFO for hours, and when I do a video on it, I probably will. But UFO, much as I love it, it wasn't a massive hit series. Now, at the time, Gerry's shows were financed by ITC, who'd created all the colourful adventure series you remember from the 60s, like Randall and Hopkirk, Deceased, Champions, The Saint. All these shows were powered by ITC, which was run by Sir Lou Gray, this hugely flamboyant, cigar-toting figure who prided himself on making these action-adventure shows on film, which he then would hope to sell on to American networks. That often didn't happen. He had the occasional success like The Saint, but some of his shows weren't successful in America. Because of that, they only ran for one season. But most of those shows, like The Champions, Randall Hopkirk, as I mentioned, The Baron, they're fondly remembered because they were so colourful and inventive and fast-paced. UFO is one of those shows. It didn't take off in America at first, but it was a terrific series, 26 episodes, 17 filmed at the MGM studios in the UK. The last production to actually film there. When they closed down, there was a production break of 9 months. Series resumed production for its last 9 episodes, slightly retooled. I think if you watch UFO, you'll see the difference in pace and style between the first 17 and the much faster paced, more actiony last 9 episodes. But UFO didn't take off. It wasn't a success, and it sort of disappeared into the background, and presumably Gerry was thinking about what to do next. Things changed in 1972, however. UFO was being screened in America, particularly some networks in New York, because lots of affiliated stations and smaller stations in the US. And UFO was shown on a lot of these, and it was very popular. It was actually topping the ratings in some of these local channels, and it was becoming quite successful, and that was being noticed by ITC bigwigs in New York. And they made approaches to ITC about a second series of UFO. Lou Grade went to Gerry Anderson, and a second series of UFO went into pre-production, but there were to be some changes. The most popular episodes in UFO, apparently in the States, were the episodes set on the moon, off Earth, on Moonbase, which was Shadow's first line of defence against the aliens from outer space. So Gerry and his wife Sylvia at the time, they set to work on creating a new format for a series that would be called UFO 1999, which would move the series forward 20 years, because UFO was set in 1980. Yes, quite. And it would focus more on Moonbase and its personnel. The lead character, Ed Straker, played brilliantly by Ed Bishop, would be located to the moon, and everything would take place on the moon. While the show was in pre-production and sketches were being done for sets and props, and actors were being contacted about returning to their roles, the ratings for UFO in New York started to dip. And ITC unfortunately got cold feet and pulled the plug on the project. Gerry, however, never wanting to let an idea go to waste, went to Lou Grade and said, well, I've done all these plans for this sequel series. Why don't I just tweak them and create a new series? And thus, Space 1999 was born. And I think you can see a sort of a connection between UFO and Space 1999. I mean, there's a Moonbase Alpha on Space 1999, and of course it has that look of Gerry Anderson shows, even though it's not a Century 21 production, because Century 21 had been wound down by now. It was still very much that glossy look about it, great special effects from Derek Meddings, and that clinical feeling about it. Space 1999 then started in the UK in September 1975. It had been in pre-production since 1973, and there were 24 episodes in the first series, and it takes us to Moonbase Alpha in September 1999. By this point, the dark side of the moon has been used as a dumping ground for nuclear waste, and Moonbase Alpha is there just monitoring the waste, making sure there aren't any problems, making sure that the waste is under control. As the series begins, Moonbase Alpha is welcoming its new commanding chief, John Koenig, played by Martin Landau. He co-starred in the series with his wife at the time, Barbara Bay. The two of them had been appearing in the long-running American adventure series Mission Impossible. That had recently ended, and these two were hot property, and ITC were pretty lucky to get them on board for this series. Barbara Bain played Moonbase Alpha's medical officer, Helena Russell, and ostensibly, I suppose, love interest with John Koenig, although that didn't come across all that much in the episodes. Something terrible happens, some new form of radioactive reaction takes place in the dumps on Moonbase Alpha, which detonate and explode. The moon is blasted out of Earth orbit and sent hurtling off into space on its own. It's a hugely unscientific premise, but it's incredibly imaginative. And I think Gerry very often puts story and idea before science, because science can be a bit restricting in terms of science fiction, ironically. So the moon is sent hurtling off into space, and the 310 or so survivors on Moonbase Alpha are travelling through space trying to find a new home, a planet they can colonise to start a new Earth. And that's the gist of the story, that's the gist of what the series is about. And across the first 24 episodes, that's how the series progresses, with the moon drifting through space and the Alphans having encounters with extraterrestrial life forms, most of whom are distinctly humanoid and a lot of whom look like huge TV and film stars of the time. I will admit that as a Doctor Who fan, there were periods watching Space 1999, and I seem to remember that it was shown on Friday nights in the UK, in my area, which was Wales and the West, thinking about 7 o'clock-ish, maybe 7:30. And there were some of those early episodes of Space 1999 which really worked because they had the budget. You could see if they went to a snow planet, it looked like a snow planet. If there was a war in space with spaceships, it looked like there was a war in space. This was all pre-Star Wars, of course, because most of the effects were done by the brilliant Derek Meddings, who passed away years ago, who brought that class to his model work, and the model filming. It looked so realistic. And I was just totally won over by Space 1999. And whilst I still watched and enjoyed Doctor Who, you couldn't help but notice the difference in quality, the cheapness of Doctor Who. For all its inventiveness, Doctor Who couldn't visually hold a candle to Space 1999. But the problems became apparent in Space 1999 as you went along. The characters were very flat and humourless. They were ciphers, and contemporary critics wheeled out the inevitable criticism with any Gerry Anderson show. The acting's as wooden as the old puppets. And that's a criticism that was true of UFO to an extent. There wasn't much humanity or light to the characters, and I think the same problem continued with Space 1999. Stories themselves, though, as I said, were an interesting mix of quite philosophical stuff. There were occasions when the stories were suggesting that Moonbase and the moon's voyage was being guided by some force. Some godlike being was protecting them. They would travel through space warps and come out the other side. And there was always this vague background indication that some supreme being was watching over the Alphans to make sure that their journey would get them to where they needed to go. It was quite an interesting idea, but it did lead to a slightly leaden pace to some episodes and a slight pompousness to the stories. But you can't fault the fact that the cast were really likeable, despite the fact we never really knew very much about them. Apart from Koenig and Helen Russell, we had veteran actor Barry Morse playing Professor Victor Bergman. I suppose he was the Doctor Who type figure on Alpha. He was the chief scientist, wise and benign and thoughtful. We had supporting characters from the Moonbase Alpha main mission. Paul Morrow, played by Prentice Hancock, who'd appeared in several Doctor Who stories and would appear in another one after Space 1999. Xenia Merton played Sandra Benesch, another operative at Moonbase Alpha. She had also appeared in Doctor Who back in the 1960s. We also had Australian heartthrob actor Nick Tate playing Alan Carter, who's the chief pilot of the Eagles. I'll come back to the Eagles shortly. We had other supporting characters, David Mathias and Kano, and there were a nice little bunch of supporting characters who didn't appear in every episode but sort of drifted in and out. But basically it was a story of the pioneering spirit of humankind torn away from Mother Earth, cast out into space looking for a new home, and the various encounters on the way. Space 1999, however, was not a hit series. Again, it had the same problems that UFO had. Didn't have a network screening in the UK, so it was all over the place. It had a very spotty scheduling. So it could never build up a following week by week because the audience was splintered across the country. Audience will be weeks or months behind the show when it debuted in a few regions. It's a similar problem in America. For all Lou Grade's efforts, the show wasn't networked in America, And again, as a consequence, couldn't build up that following that they hoped that the show would get. And Space 1999 tottered towards cancellation. It did look as if there wouldn't be a second season. But ITC in America felt that if the show could be retooled a bit more, made a bit more Star Trek-y, and made into more of an adventure series, perhaps it could pick up that following that it hadn't had first time round, because it was considered to be a bit too intellectual. Big changes were coming to the series on screen and behind the screen. By now, Gerry Anderson's relationship with his wife Sylvia, which had been fractious for a little while, fractured, and they split acrimoniously. Gerry was on his own making the series now, whereas she'd been fairly instrumental in terms of fashion and certain concepts in most of his earlier series. But now Gerry was on his own, and ITC drafted in a producer by the name of Fred Freeberger to help lighten up Space 1999 and make it a bit more inclusive for the audience that it was aimed at. This was unfortunate in a way, because Fred Freeberger was notorious as the producer who was in charge of Star Trek when it was killed off in its third series. He was also in charge of the final series of Mission Impossible. So he had a bit of a track record as something of a Grim Reaper. Now he came along, relocated to London, and looked at Space 1999 and decided what it needed was change. Big change. A smaller cast, smaller sets, different types of stories, lighter stories, more shocky science fiction stories. Stories full of monsters and action. And characters who were lightened up and a little bit more humorous. One of the many changes in Season 2 was the replacement of Barry Gray's striking, strident theme music for the first series' urgent, pounding, typically Barry Gray theme, replaced for Season 2 by a jazzier, up-tempo piece by Derek Wadsworth, which actually, if you watch the episodes, I think suits the tone of the episodes. It's much more ferocious and faster and urgent, and the whole title sequence is refashioned to emphasise action. But there were bigger changes afoot too. Cast members disappeared, unnoticed and unmentioned. Victor Bergman, played by Barry Morse, didn't appear in Season 2. The character disappeared, we don't know what happened to him. In truth, Barry Morse, who hadn't had a particularly great time filming the first series, he didn't really rate the scripts, decided he didn't want to come back for the second series, particularly when he was offered less money, because I think the budget was slightly reduced for the second season. So the series went into production without him. As production was beginning, he changed his mind and decided he would come back, but by now that was too late, unfortunately. So it was bye-bye Victor. There was no explanation for his absence in the series, but apparently in the first episode, The Metamorph, there was a line in the script about Victor having died in a space accident with a spacesuit malfunction, but that was excised from the script. So there was no mention for his departure. Neither was there any mention for the departure of Paul Morrow, played by Prentice Hancock. Xenia Mertens, Sandra Benesch stayed on, but only appeared in a handful of episodes. These characters just vanished without trace. And in fact, Fred Freeberger, in making changes to the series, he got rid of these characters because he felt that the audience didn't care about them, hadn't really connected with them. And he was actually going to get rid of Nick Tate's Alan Carter, until it was pointed out to him that the character was extremely popular as a heartthrob and as a second male lead. But in terms of second male lead, two new characters were brought in. Tony Vedecci was a security officer on Moonbase Alpha, who'd never appeared in the first series, never been mentioned, we'd never heard the name. He was played by Tony Anholt, and he appeared in Season 2 as if he'd always been there. Nobody mentioned the fact that he'd never been seen before. He was just suddenly an important part of the Alpha crew. The most significant change to Season 2, I suppose, is the introduction of Catherine Schell as Maya, a shape-shifting alien from the planet Psychon, in the first episode of Season 2, The Metamorph. She comes to the planet when her father, played by Brian Blessed, is killed. She's orphaned, so she comes aboard Alpha, and she has the ability to transform herself into various animals, which inevitably tend to be birds, hawks, cougars. There's not a massive variety of creatures that she became. Her introduction, I suppose, is symptomatic of the way the series changed in terms of the stories it was telling. Now it was telling far more fanciful stories, outrageous space adventure stories, and the edict seemed to be more monsters, more monsters. And there's quite a well-heeled anecdote about the production of the series. One of the most infamous stories of the second season is The Bringers of Wonder, a two-part story where these jelly-like one-eyed aliens take over Alpha, but only Commander Koenig can see them in their real form. They appear as humanoids to the rest of the crew. They're ridiculous-looking things. They look a bit like the Gel Guard from Doctor Who's The Three Doctors, but less convincing. And so it is said that having obeyed the edict to put in more creatures and ridiculous-looking monsters that wouldn't be out of place in Lost in Space in the 1960s, ITC execs from New York came along and said, what's with all the monsters? Why have we got these monsters in this? It was very much a case of left hand and right hand not knowing what each other were doing. ITC in America left it to Fred Freeberger to carry out the changes they'd asked for, and when that was done, they didn't like those changes and refused to accept they ever wanted them. I will admit here and now I've not seen all of Season 2 of Space 1999. I've seen all of Season 1, and there are some pretty good episodes in there, and I'll point out some of the better episodes from Season 1 shortly. But I didn't get through Season 2 because I could see the difference. It looked cheaper. Main Mission, which was this huge expansive set overlooking the moon, was now refocused and retitled as the Command Centre, which was now underground, and it was a much smaller set. The reason for this is that the show filming in Pinewood now had smaller sound stages, so didn't have room for the big Main Mission set. Some of the other sets were shortened. The cockpit of the Eagle spaceship was shortened. The medical centre sets were all, it was all smaller. It seemed more compact. Didn't seem as big as the first series. It seemed like what it was, a cheaper version of the first series, but less accomplished in terms of its storytelling. So I can't really comment very much on Season 2 because I've never sat through all of it. Season 1, however, does have its good moments. There are some good episodes. I mean, Breakaway is a superb first episode because it feels like proper science fiction. A little bit humorless, yes, but that's a problem that the series had all the way through that first series. But there are other good episodes. There's Dragon's Domain, which I think is a very famous episode, where the Alphans discover this abandoned spaceship, which has a link to Helena's husband, I believe, as I recall, with this huge thrashing tentacled creature which is in the doorway of the spaceship. Stuff of nightmares, and even now people who watched the show at the time will remember that as an example of how terrifying the show could be. Then there were things like War Games, which had this massive space battle sequence. Death Star the Dominion, an episode I watched fairly recently actually, which is an ice planet episode. And this is an episode which really pulled me into the series because you had the Eagle spaceships, more on them in a moment, landing on this ice planet where there was survivors of a crashed human spaceship, created a way of life under the ice, but there was a terrible twist to their way of existence. And it just had a scope and a scale to it, and spaceships buried in the snow and people fighting their way through the snow. It just seemed so exciting. There's also a notorious episode called The Last Sunset, where an alien device brings an atmosphere to the Earth's surface. And the Alphans react as you would expect people on a base on the moon to do. They opened all the windows to let the oxygen in. You do have to wonder why a base on the moon has windows with handles that you can open them. But hey, that's the story. But generally Season 1 was entertaining, but I think anybody watching it, even at the time, would have thought this needs something bit more oomph to it. Certainly visually there were no problems with the effects. I mean, it had a classic Derek Meddings design. Derek Meddings' spaceships and rockets for Anderson shows are the stuff of legend. The Thunderbirds craft, all the superb vehicles from UFO, and iconically, for Space 1999, the Eagle Transporter. A work of art, gorgeous looking creation. I mean, look at this, all these gantries and struts and landing pads. It does look like what it is supposed to be. A beast of burden, a workhorse spaceship. Not a long haul spaceship, but something that travels short distances around Alpha. And they must have had a plentiful supply of these because many of them were destroyed across the series, but you constantly saw several of them flying around in each episode. And to point out how iconic this design is, this is the Space 1999 Eagle. So iconic, even though the shape doesn't necessarily reflect it. Let's think about the Millennium Falcon in Star Wars a couple of years later. Millennium, 1999, Falcon, Eagle. That's the impact that this machine made on certain people. I mean, it wasn't a massive public hit, but people like George Lucas and his team working on Star Wars paid homage to this machine, this gorgeous space vehicle, in one of the most legendary science fiction films of all time. And of course there were other devices. There were the stun guns and the comlock devices. These are all cheap wooden replicas that I picked up over the years. But it had all that glitzy gadgetry that you expect of Gerry Anderson shows. So like Season 1, Season 2 came and went. It was even less successful than the first season. And the series ended on a low point with an episode called The Dawkins. I must also make a point of mentioning the famous anecdote about Fred Freeberger, the producer who relocated to London to work on Space 1999. Travelling to the studios one day, he saw a sign near London pointing towards Luton. He thought, that sounds like an interesting name. Thus, the infamous Rules of Luton episode arrived in Space 1999 second season. You do have to wonder how much influence Gerry Anderson had at this point, because some of the things that Fred Freeberger put through on the series must have stuck in Gerry's throat. He must have seen how his original concept and his original idea was being diluted and bastardized. But at this point, maybe he was worn down by his constant battles with Sylvia. He was just glad to have a chance to make another TV series at a time of uncertainty with the end of Century 21, and just fell on his sword and let these changes happen. But unfortunately, in doing so, Space 1999 was scuppered and the show fizzled out after its 48th episode. There were some rumours of a third series, in fact, which was going to be 13 episodes with a slightly raised budget to bring it back up to the standards of the first season. But when it became clear that the show wasn't really connecting, those plans seemed to have been abandoned, as indeed were plans for a spin-off series featuring Catherine Schell as Mayor. I had the pleasure of speaking to Catherine Schell a few years ago for an interview when her excellent autobiography book came out, and she mentioned that she had been spoken to about a spin-off series, but it really went no further than that. No scripts were written, no concept put together, but there were some ideas that she could spin off into something, but it never came to anything. Thus ended Space 1999, and thus ended for a while Gerry Anderson's status as a major TV producer in the UK. It all ended for him here, and he entered a period where he dropped out of the public eye. His shows got rerun in certain places. Certainly there was a resurrection in the 90s, but Gerry was never happy with the puppet shows that he did, and he sort of decried them as crap, and he didn't really embrace what they meant to a lot of people. He had a long period out in the cold until he did sort of make a comeback in the 80s with occasionally enjoyable Terrorhawks, and then he did another live action series in 1996 called Space Precinct, but that's another story. So that's my quick run through of Space 1999. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been fun talking about a show I know quite well, and even though I don't love the show in the way I love UFO and Thunderbirds, I do have an affection for it because it is one of those shows that's so nearly great. It has a massive fan following even today. It's very well regarded by its fans, and it still exists. I mean, there's still new merchandise coming out. You'll see them there. The anthology of old looking comic strips have been coming out courtesy of Anderson Entertainment, and there are new books planned. There's a new novella which came out, which I've just about finished reading, called The Armageddon Engine by James Swallow. So the Anderson shows, all these shows, they never die. They always have their cult followings who keep them going in one way or another. But it does seem a shame that for all the imagination and the creativity that went into the show, it never took off in the way it should have done. And that is a shame because it is an enjoyable show. I can't speak for Series 2, as I said, because I've not watched much of it. But Season 1 is hugely entertaining. Right, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, my first Anderson video of the year. There will be more coming because I just love that heritage of shows, and I want to champion them here. So if you have enjoyed this video, and if you're new here, why not press that subscribe button, which is there. You can also press the like button, leave a comment. Tell me what you think of Space 1999. I can imagine that quite a few of my viewers are familiar with the show, probably fans of the show. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, your favourite episodes, and if you're still into the show today, or may even have forgotten it. It's always interesting. Do you hear from people who say, oh God, I remember that show? And it's always nice to remind people of things they enjoyed when they were younger. It's part of what this channel's about. So please like and subscribe. Stick around, leave a comment. I will see you soon. Till I do, keep taking the stuff.